Starting to record. Cool. So, second paper, or I mean, really, that first writing assignment, I turned it into more of like a essay response thing. But so this is kind of more like your first real paper. Um, due next Friday, I believe, before spring break, so that you don't have to worry about it. Um, it's on skepticism. It's on one of the four arguments that are in the prompt. They're four of the sort of most straightforward arguments in the skepticism literature. Two of them are pretty easy arguments, I think, like both on the skepticism side and on the responses, like responding to them side. And two of them are very difficult, uh, both like as arguments. They're complicated and very interesting and very difficult to see how you could possibly escape them. Um, the paper, I believe, is supposed to be 800 words. Um, what I want from you in this is for you to describe and explain each of these arguments, or not each of them, but to choose one, and then describe and explain that argument in particular, meaning give the argument, explain each premise, explain how the conclusion follows from the premises, and kind of give a mini defense of the strength of the argument, which is basically what I do in lecture and what I'll be doing here. And then sort of about face and give uh, a criticism of the argument by picking a premise to deny, and explaining how you can, justify denying the premise, right? What reasons are there for thinking that the premise is false, and how that ultimately leads to the failing of the argument itself. Um, cool. Or at least leads you to not have to accept the conclusion of the argument based on the premises of the argument, because the argument is no longer sound. All right. I think one other person just showed up. So last time, here's the Google form for signing in. I'll send it maybe again at the end. But yeah, just sign in once. You don't need to sign in more than once. Make sure you get your name on there so that you can get extra credit. All right. Unless somebody has any questions, let's go on to the first task. All right. Skeptical arguments. So we're starting. We've got four different arguments that you can choose from. The first two I'll go through pretty quickly. I think the possibility of error argument, the certainty argument. Then we'll get to the transmissibility argument and the FLP argument. For your papers, there's a few different things you can do. If you don't understand epistemology, or you're like a little bit confused, or you're a little bit lost here, I would highly recommend you choose the possibility of error, like one of the possibility of error argument or the certainty argument. They're both a little bit more straightforward and easier to deal with. You could probably write a better paper about these arguments if you are somewhat lost. The other two arguments are challenging, and so anyone that tries to write a paper about those will sort of automatically, I will be seeing like, great, I'm excited that you've taken on this challenge, but also realize that it might be harder for you to actually do really well on that challenge, because it's a more difficult argument to adequately explain. The nice thing about this argument and the certainty argument is that they're pretty straightforward when it comes to explaining them. And that's really, like, 75% of the whole point of this paper is to make sure that I can see you telling me in your own terms and your own way an explanation of the argument. I can see that you fully understand what's going on here. All right. So the possibility of error argument. Again, we're in this section of epistemology where we're talking about skepticism. In particular, we're talking about skepticism of the external world. So you got to remember there's a difference between the external world and what you might think of as the internal world. Skepticism about things that you see, touch, taste, feel, like things that are outside of you, versus being skeptical of things like that you exist, right? That's something that you shouldn't be skeptical of, because doubting that you exist is a good enough reason to think that you exist, right? Because you're doing something, you're doubting. Similarly, any internal, like, states of yourself, like emotional states, it seems like you have pretty good access to, those things. Like it'd be hard to imagine a situation in which you were, you thought you were sad and you weren't actually sad, right? Right, like that's just a feeling that you have inside of you, and so it's, you shouldn't be skeptical of your own feelings along those lines. And so, yeah, the internal world, we're not so worried about that. Here, the skepticism is external world skepticism. We're worried about, like, whether or not it's possible that we are wrong about everything that we believe in the external world, about the external world. So how does this argument go from the, perspective of the skeptic? So this one, the possibility of error argument, to be distinguished from the certainty argument, focuses on the bare possibility of being in error, and from that bare possibility gets to the conclusion that we don't know anything. So there are two very plausible premises. Premise one: for almost any belief any person has about the external world, that belief could be mistaken. I think almost here has to do with, like, the fact that you exist seems to be at least partly to do with the external world, or like just the fact that you're experiencing something external to yourself, right? That's a belief about the external world that I don't think you could be in error about, just the fact that you're experiencing something at all. But that's neither here nor there currently, because that is such a general, a general belief that you have. Here we're talking about very, very straightforward things, like that you're looking at a computer screen right now, that the color of, the coffee cup that you're holding is white, or something, or whatever color it is. Like those kinds of beliefs, really simple things about the external world, like where you're located right now, right? Like the idea here is that almost any belief that you could possibly have about the external world could be mistaken. And this could here is very, very, very loose, very, very open, right? It's possible that you could be mistaken right now. Say you're looking at your coffee cup and it looks red to you. And it just so happens that really you're in a room with some red lighting. Well, the coffee cup looks red to you, but it's not actually red. The lighting is what's creating the redness, right? That's a mistake that you've made in your belief. And it's sort of easy to see how it's possible that that could have happened, right? The idea here is supposed to be just that it's super, like, you can imagine all kinds of scenarios, right? We can go to the fully skeptical scenarios, right? Like where you're looking at your hands and it turns out that you're in the matrix, or it turns out that you're actually asleep and dreaming of your hands, right? In those situations, the beliefs that you have, the beliefs about the external world in this particular case, are mistaken because of the situation that you're in. All right, so premise one seems pretty plausible, pretty undeniable in a sense, because it does seem right? You can, for any belief that you can have about the external world, that all that premise one saying is that there's a situation that you could gin up that would be a situation in which that belief about the external world is mistaken. So as long as you can come up with something like that, then that premise is going to be true. All right, from premise one, we get premise two. If a belief could be mistaken, then it is not a case of knowledge. Here, again, we're going from the possibility of a mistake to not knowledge. This is the conditional premise, right? If a belief could be mistaken, then it's not a case of knowledge. And the thought here is supposed to be something like this. Look, knowledge needs to be on solid foundations. anything that you know, anything, so like any belief that you have that is going to be something that you know, needs to be something that is fully justified and really on solid ground. So it would be it'd be ridiculous to say that you know something if you also in the same breath can admit that you could be mistaken, right? So like your roommate was at the bank yesterday and you need to get to the bank to deposit your check so that you can pay rent this weekend, something like that, right? And you ask your roommate whether or not the bank is going to be open at 5 p.m. tomorrow. And they're like, yeah, I'm pretty sure. And then you're like, well, do you know? And they're like, yeah. And then you're like, well, couldn't you be wrong? Like, and they're like, yeah, I could totally be wrong, but I know. That sounds awful, right? That doesn't sound like something that someone should say. It sounds like they're like saying something and then taking it back in the same breath. So it would, you know, the the basic idea of the justification for premise 2 here, this conditional statement, is supposed to be, look, knowledge requires beliefs that are mistake free, right? Um, you you can't, if you have a false belief, it can't be knowledge. So if you can be mistaken about your belief, then it also seems like it couldn't be knowledge. Okay, well, from premise 1 and premise 2, we just get this following conclusion. Therefore, any belief any person has about the external world is not knowledge. In other words, no one knows anything or more than very little about the external world. Wild, right? From these two premises that seem plausible on their own, you get this devastatingly skeptical conclusion that it turns out you can have beliefs about the external world, but you can't know anything about the external world because it's possible for your beliefs to be mistaken about the external world. And if it's possible for a belief to be mistaken, then you can't call it a case of knowledge. All right. This is a, strong and interesting argument for the conclusion of skepticism. And what I just did there was explain each of the premises, give you some sort of reasoning behind the thoughts behind each of the premises. I want you to do that in your paper. I want you to lay out the argument and do what I just did. That's basically the first half, maybe 2/3 of your paper, is just explaining the whole argument and why it seems plausible, why it seems right to, the skeptic at least. And then the next part is what I'm about to do now, which is criticizing this argument. So, okay, so if you were to take on this argument, how might you criticize it? Well, this argument is a valid argument, meaning that the conclusion follows if the premises are true. And that's just from the structure of this argument. It's called a modus ponens style argument, which just means that the premises are set up in such a way that the conclusion has to be true if the premises are true. So it's valid, which means that if you disagree with the conclusion, you can't just say, "Oh, the premises are fine," but the conclusion, nope, the conclusion's false. You have to also disagree with one of the premises. So you have to pick a premise to deny. Well, what are you gonna do here? In this case, I think it's very difficult to deny premise 1. Why? Well, for the same exact reasoning that I gave a second ago when I was describing premise 1. It's like all premise 1 says is that any belief about the external world could be mistaken. And all that means is that it's like a bare possibility that you could be mistaken about your belief. So any possible, like, just imagine any wild and out there scenario that could ultimately lead you to being mistaken about any particular belief you have about the external world, right? So like, I think my car is currently in the parking lot outside, but I could be wrong because my car could be stolen, right? My car could have been stolen since the last time I saw it, and that's a mere possibility. And the fact that it's a mere possibility means, that that's a belief about the external world that I could be mistaken about. All right, well, what about premise 2 then? Premise 2 seems to be the one that you'd probably have to deny here if you choose this argument. If a belief could be mistaken, then it is not a case of knowledge. The question here is really on the emphasis on this word could in could be mistaken. And the question here is like whether or not it's really true that merely the case of could be mistaken leads to a situation where you don't have knowledge. And here's what I mean, right? Like, you could be mistaken about everything, right? Like, there's so few things that you can't be mistaken about. Like Descartes pointed out, right, that you can't be mistaken about your own existence on the basis of doubting your own existence, right? Because to do that, you would have to exist to doubt, right? So I think, therefore, I am. But it's like being mistaken, if you have like all of possibility in front of you, you can always come up with a crazy, wild, and out there science fiction like case in which you could be mistaken about some belief that you have, right? Like, you could, like, your belief that what you had for breakfast yesterday. We could imagine a possible crazy out there scenario where God exists and he created the world last night at midnight and gave it a history, or gave everybody that like lives in the world memories. Well, okay, like yeah, that's a crazy possibility. And in that case, your belief about what you had for breakfast yesterday would be false because you didn't actually exist yesterday, right? Um, that would be wild, but it seems like an extreme possibility. So you could be mistaken about what you had for breakfast yesterday. That's like the fact that that's up on the table here seems wild. And so if you were like me and you want to deny premise 2, what you might say is something like, look, just because you can be mistaken, in certain wild and out cases, doesn't mean that you're precluded from having knowledge in those cases. Because some of those cases are just so infinitesimally improbable. They're so unlikely. They're so wild and out. They're so out there that, like, we need to restrict the kinds of possibility here, right? Like, the basic idea behind premise 2 is right, but the could is too broad. The basic idea is that, like, look, we need our knowledge to be based on firm foundations, and firm foundations shouldn't be the kinds of things that can be mistaken very easily. But that's not what this says, right? Things that could be mistaken easily is different than could be mistaken at all. Eris, I think you have a question. You want to ask it?
Yeah, isn't there like sort of a problem with that response in the sense that, like, I mean, just because God created the universe yesterday is like an out there possibility to us, that doesn't necessarily mean that like it's improbable, because how do you even quantify like whether or not something like that is probable? There's no way you could possibly measure it.
Sure. So it's it's improbable because it's very unlikely to have occurred, if that makes sense, right? It would be, yeah, it's I guess in one sense, yes, it's hard to say how improbable it is, but it's very improbable, right? Because you can take every possible moment that exists in the whole, of time, and you could make the same argument for it, right? God could have just, blinked all of us into existence 2 minutes ago, or 3 minutes ago, or 4 minutes ago, or 5 minutes ago. So for each individual action of that, it's like improbable that he did it right at that time, if that makes sense, right?
I mean, I guess for that particular argument that sort of applies, but then how do you like go about refuting like I'm a brain in a vat? Because
Oh,
that's
sure, but
something that could
yeah.
like
So that's
continuously be true.
we're gonna get to that. That's the third argument in this series of arguments. This is just this particular argument that we're focusing on here. Anybody else? Cool. All right, so how you could deny this argument, deny premise two, how you could do that. You can talk about the difference between being mistaken in all possibilities and being easily mistaken in situations in which things are like where, like your roommate and the bank. Your roommate probably didn't know, like doesn't actually know when the bank closes, right? Because they could easily be mistaken in that situation. And so we generally don't want to say, that in situations where you can easily be mistaken, that you have knowledge. But in cases where you could just possibly be mistaken, you might, you probably still have knowledge. We still, like, I still know this is a hand. I still know my car is out in the parking lot. Just because it's possible that someone stole it in the last 24 hours does not mean that I don't know my car is in the parking lot, right? Like, it's there. I can go look at it right now if I wanted to. I'm not going to, but I could go look at it right now. And just the mere possibility that like, just because I'm alerting you to the possibility that it could have gotten stolen doesn't mean that I don't know that it's there. All right, next argument. So certainty argument, very similar to the previous argument. And so like, yeah, like we haven't gotten to the complicated ones yet. Like the next one is the brain in the vat argument is coming. So, hold on to your butts. um, uh, yeah, I guess you don't have one if you're a brain in a vat. So the certainty argument, very similar to the possibility of error argument, but focuses more centrally on the notion of certainty than the notion of possibly being mistaken. Um, Basically, the same sort of thing is going to go here, and the same kind of response is going to go here as well. So premise one seems very plausible. If S knows P, that is S for any individual and P for any proposition, particularly propositions about the external world here, then S is absolutely certain of P, right? The idea here being that if you know something, then you're certain of it. And that's like, the example earlier, your roommate doesn't know what time the bank closes because, they admit that they could be wrong, right? They're not absolutely certain that the bank closes at a certain time. This following statement sounds weird sometimes, right? I know my car is in the parking lot, but I am not certain that my car is in the parking lot. Like, what? That sounds terrible, right? Like, really? How can you know if you're not certain? Seems weird. All right, premise two. No one is ever absolutely certain of anything about the external world. This seems plausible because absolute certainty is something that's very difficult to have. Like absolute certainty, like I am absolutely certain that 2 + 2 = 4, but that's because math is like that, right? Math is set up in a way where there are certain kinds of automatic necessities that provide for absolute certainty. But things in the external world, like I'm not absolutely certain that my coffee cup is red because of the same sort of thing that happens, in the earlier situation, right? Like I could be having a hallucination right now. I could be a brain in a vat, right? I could be dreaming. There are all these wild and out there possibilities that I am not certain of, that I'm not certain that they don't, that they aren't happening. And so I can't be absolutely certain that this cup is red because I'm not absolutely certain that none of that stuff is happening. And so I'm not certain. I mean, and so I have to admit, right, and according to this argument, that if I think I know the cup is red, but then I admit that I'm not certain of it, then I have to admit, that situation. It seems weird. It seems like if I know that the cup is red, then I am absolutely certain that the cup is red. So, conclusion, no one knows anything about the external world. This argument, again, is, it's very similar to the first argument, but instead of focusing on the possibility of error, it focuses on the notion of absolute certainty. There is a distinction to be drawn here between the feeling of certainty and the sort of actual being of certainty, right? So they call this doxastic certainty. So there's the psychological feeling of being sure is clearly not going to matter here, right? Like your roommate could be sure that the bank is going to close at a certain time, but be wrong, right? And so that's not being certain. They're not. The feeling that they have is a feeling like a certain thing, but that doesn't. I'm sure everybody's experienced this where they were like, "Oh, I was sure," right, and then I was wrong. That's not what we're talking about here. Actual certainty in this kind of case, what we're looking for is like guaranteed truth, right? So guaranteed truth is going to be like you believe something and it's guaranteed to be true. Like anytime that you know something, that thing is guaranteed. Ultimately, if it's guaranteed, then there's not going to be any possibility that it could be wrong, right? No possibility of it being not true. And so again, this brings up the same situation as the earlier argument where we're talking about the possibility of error. So how then do you deny this kind of argument? Well, in this case, premise 2 is the one that's harder to deny, right? No one's ever absolutely certain of anything about the external world. That does seem pretty spot on. Like there are very few things that you could possibly imagine to say where anyone or everyone ever is absolutely certain of that concerning the external world. And this again is because it's possible to gin up lots of different situations in which it seems like you shouldn't be absolutely certain. But premise 1 is, I think, too strong. And why say that? Well, if you notice, premise 1, it doesn't say this. It doesn't say that if you're certain, then you know. What it says is if you know, then you're certain. There's a level of relationship here. There's a level of dependence here from that this premise is claiming from knowing to being certain. Now, I am totally on board with going from certainty to going to knowledge, right? If I'm certain of something, and this is not just a feeling, like if I am certain of something, like 2 + 2 = 4, then I know that 2 + 2 = 4, right? That is a guarantee because certainty really is this like highfalutin, devastatingly difficult to attain form of knowledge, right? Absolute certainty. We have an extra word on there, absolute, to just tell you how high it is. Whereas knowledge, I think knowledge isn't so difficult, isn't so big, isn't so high, isn't so hard to attain as absolute certainty. Think about it. You can think about it in lots of different ways, right? Like a baby. A baby knows its mother from its father or from from strangers. Can a baby even be absolutely certain of anything? I don't think so, right? Like, because it's not cognitively developed enough yet. But babies do know things in some sense. Knows when it's hungry, right? Absolutely certain of when it's hungry. I don't know. That's a weird thing to think about. But yeah, like there are different levels here, and you know, while I seemingly do know that my cup is red, having absolute certainty, that's hard to say because absolute certainty seems to require a crazy amount of stuff to kind of, you have to like hold off all of these other wild and out there possibilities again to be absolutely certain of something. All right. Anybody have any questions about the certainty argument? If you're writing your paper and you want to write a paper that is much more straightforward and easy, like just easy from my perspective, write it on this argument or the previous one. Be sure whichever one you choose to get it clear which one you're writing about. I don't like this happens a lot. People write a paper on the certainty argument and then the whole time they're talking about the possibility of error. Don't do that, right? Make sure you're talking about certainty. if you're talking about the certainty argument. And same vice versa. If you're talking about the possibility of error argument, don't talk about certainty at all because it doesn't come up. These are very similar arguments, but they're different ways of thinking about the same sort of issue. All right. On to the transmissibility argument, or the brain in the vat, right? And this is called the transmissibility argument, I think, because it relies on this premise 3, where there's this like transmission of knowing from one thing to the other thing, and so it's really hard to break that level of transmission. And when you see that the transmission is occurring, then you're like, oh man, that is a crazy fact. All right, so this argument is difficult to get your head around and difficult to see how you could possibly deny it. So I do not suggest writing your paper about this, but you are welcome to if you find it as fascinating as I do, and fun. It's a fun argument. It's probably a more fun paper to write if you are already at that level of like competence and you've grasped all of this and you really know what's going on. All right, so to begin with, there are two preliminaries. We've got statement O and statement SK. Statement O is going to be any ordinary external world proposition. Proposition is just a statement. So here we've got the statement, I have hands. SK is going to be the skeptical hypothesis. And SK basically can be any skeptical hypothesis that's inconsistent with O, like that you're dreaming, that you're being deceived by an evil demon, that you're a brain in a vat, that you're in the matrix, etc. Here we can go with that you're a brain in a vat. The basic idea there being that you definitely don't have hands if you're a brain in a vat. You are a brain that is in a vat in some sort of sci-fi situation where there's, aliens or doctors or something like that have plugged the brain into all of these like electrode things, and they are feeding it experiences through electrical stimulation. That is the skeptical hypothesis. It's that you are not sitting at your computer watching me. You are a brain in a vat that is being fed simulation of you sitting at a computer watching me. I don't know why they're taking their time to teach you philosophy in this situation. Teaching you skepticism. That would be, what if you were a brain in a vat and you were in a class on skepticism? Man, that would be wild. Okay. So two statements, O and SK. Premise 1, S, take any person, just plug them in for S, does not know that SK is false. Okay, why is this plausible? Well, think about what it would take to know that the skeptical hypothesis is false. Right now, like the skeptical hypothesis says that you are currently a brain in a vat plugged in to all of this machinery that is feeding you a perfect simulation of exactly what it is that you're experiencing right now. The claim is that you cannot know that possibility is off the table, that possibility is false, that possibility is not currently occurring. Why do you not know that? Well, because everything would seem exactly the same. Nothing would be different. There are no glitches in the matrix in this scenario. We're just imagining a situation in which everything feels the same, seems the same, looks the same, smells the same, right? Everything's the same, according to this skeptical hypothesis theory. So it seems like S doesn't know. Like, you can't know that hypothesis is false, right? All right, well, from that, it turns out that O, that you have hands, implies that the skeptical hypothesis is false. And you know that the statement that you have hands, if it's true, that implies that the skeptical hypothesis is false. How is that the case? Skeptical hypothesis involves you being a brain in a vat. Right? You being a brain in a vat. If you're a brain in a vat, you don't have hands. If you have hands, you're not a brain in a vat. Right? Okay, that's the claim. From there, now we get to the transmission premise. If S knows that O is true, and that O implies that SK is false, then S can know that SK is false. So the claim here is, if S, you, know that O is true, that you have hands, and you know that you having hands implies that the skeptical hypothesis is false, then you can know that the skeptical hypothesis is false. But we already have this premise one, that says you don't know that the skeptical hypothesis is false. In fact, maybe we can make it stronger. You cannot know that the skeptical hypothesis is false because of the way that it's set up. Everything would seem the same. And if you cannot know that the skeptical hypothesis is false, then we can do this thing called a modus tollens, right? Which is basically premise one is the denial of the consequent of premise three, which is the then part of premise three. So modus tollens argument basically reverts to, okay, so now we know the negation of the first part, the antecedent of premise three. So it turns out that you do not know, you do not know that you have hands. Wild, right? Skeptical argument extraordinaire. Like, this is the most difficult and interesting skeptical hypothesis, skeptical argument, I think, that's out there. It's very difficult to see how you could respond to it. Anybody have any questions or comments or want to take a crack at it? So it's pretty much it's un it's unpopular and very bad in philosophy to try and deny premise three. Some philosophers did do it at one point. They were like, no, the transmission doesn't go through, and they were trying to imagine a scenario in which they could possibly deny premise three, and it made for some really messy philosophical epistemological theories. I don't, you should not even worry about that. Right? Premise two also can't really be denied, I think, right? Because it's just a fact that if you have hands, then you're not a brain in a vat, right? Having hands, really being this person that has hands, right? Whatever other claim, right? Like this coffee cup being red, uh, if it is really it's a fact, if that's a fact, like that implies that this coffee cup exists and that there's not like some skeptical scenario where this is like a dream coffee cup or like just some impulses being sent to me uh by scientists or aliens, right? And I know that, right? So premise two here is really hard to deny. So what can you do? It looks like you're stuck denying premise one. And it's hard to see how you can deny premise one because of the way that we set premise one up. Remember, the thought is that what's the skeptical scenario? The skeptical scenario is everything is exactly the same as it is, except really underlying everything, you're a brain in a vat that's being fed that's being fed the experience that you're having. Which is wild, right? So there's no way you could tell if you're not a brain in a vat. So it seems like the fact that there's no way to tell means that you can't possibly know that you aren't a brain in a vat. That was the thought process. But according to this claim here, this argument here, you're stuck deciding between one of two things. Either you're stuck believing that you have hands and you know that you have hands. If you believe you have hands and then you're like, look, here they are. Well, now it seems like I know I have hands. And then you realize, well, if I know I have hands, then the skeptical hypothesis has got to be false. And so on the basis of just knowing that you have hands, you now know that the skeptical hypothesis is false. But how, right? The skeptical hypothesis would be like, you would still feel like you had hands in the skeptical hypothesis. You still see them, you'd still like be able to feel them and everything. The experience would still be the same according to the way that we set it all up. So you basically get stuck between these two possibilities. It's like either you know you have hands or you don't know that the skeptical hypothesis is false, right? And you're stuck now between this rock and hard place because it seems like you know you have hands, and it also seems like you don't know that the skeptical hypothesis is false. And how do you decide between the two? Well, so philosophically, I don't know, right? Like I would abstain myself from this situation, but famously, this guy G.E. Moore, who sort of introduced the idea of like worrying about having hands. That's because the skeptical hypothesis, like a lot of them, they're worried about like random external world possibilities where G.E. Moore was like, look, I am certain that I have hands. I know that I have hands. Maybe not certain is the wrong word, but like this is like, look, this is a hand. Like, here we go. I'm showing y'all. Got my hands right here. And he said basically something like, look, like talking about the internal, like psychological level of certainty. He's like, look, I am more willing to side with between these two claims, right? The claim that I have hands and the claim that I don't know that the skeptical hypothesis is false. He's like, I'm more willing to go with that I have hands. That just seems more like easier, more straightforward. There's something way more complicated about knowing that the skeptical hypothesis is false, right? Or not knowing that the skeptical hypothesis is false, that he thought like, okay, if it's just a choice between the two, I'm going with the hands. And that is not necessarily like a very satisfying response here, but it's the response that you kind of have to give. It's this response that's sometimes called dogmatism, which you might have heard of like religious dogmatism or something like that, which is usually thought of as bad. And dogmatism in this case maybe is still bad, but the idea is that in order, like if it's the only way to get out of the skeptical issue, then it seems like, yeah, okay, like what? Like, I mean, this is another way of thinking about like maybe like with the certainty stuff or the possibility of error stuff. It seems like knowing that I have hands is like something that should be easy. They're right there in front of me, right? This is like the best evidence I have. But knowing that the skeptical hypothesis is false, I don't even know what kind of evidence I would need to have to be able to know that the skeptical hypothesis is false. Like outside of the basic stuff, like I have hands, right? So, yeah, maybe there's something there. All right. I hope that you enjoy that argument as much as I do. It is a difficult one and interesting and hard to think about. Any questions or comments at this point? It's fine if not.
When we write our papers, do
Mhm.
we have to try to deny one of the premises, or can we
Yeah.
just be like, this is an argument and I don't see any issues with that?
Yeah, no, so you need to discuss the possibility of denying it. So like if you buy this argument and you want to write about it, that's fine. But in the paper, the way that the paper prompt is set up is asking you need to at least address the possibility of denying one of the premises and talk about what it would be like to deny the premise, what the kind of argument there is, why it seems like you can deny this premise if you can. Right. Yeah. So it's just built into the structure of the writing assignment that, yeah, you need to do that. And this is one of those ones that's like really hard to see how you can deny any of the premises, right? Like I don't even know how to deny premise one other than to get to this place where I'm trying to like massage you into the belief that I have hands is something that is like more believable and is more believable that I know that I have hands than the claim that I know that the skeptical hypothesis, that I don't know that the skeptical hypothesis is false. So, all right. Last argument. The future like past principle. All right, this argument is another complicated one. And there's a lot of ins and outs here. If you want to go for it, I'd say go for it. But this one is difficult to figure out what to do with. All right, this argument basically is trying to show you that you do not know anything about the future. Like you don't know that tomorrow is even going to exist. That seems crazy, right? Tomorrow will certainly exist. The sun will rise tomorrow. We seem to know that sort of stuff. Why? Well, it's based on our ability to inductively reason. We reason towards the future based on how things have happened in the past, it seems. And and we rely on this future like past principle that says that look, things in the future are going to be like things were in the past. And that seems like a good justification for believing. And insofar as it seems like a good justification for believing things in the future are going to be like things in the past, if it is a good justification, then we seemingly know the things that are based upon it, right? Like that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. Okay, well, problem. The future like past principle, which it seems like we use in our reasoning about the future, that principle itself has to be justified by something. It has to be based on something. There has to be a good reason for believing it, for believing it's true. And premise one says, well, okay, well, if your belief in the future like past principle is justified, then it's got to be justified either one of two ways. The two ways that we pretty much justify everything: direct observation or inductive reasoning. Direct observation, you just see it, right? Like everybody can believe that this cup is red because they can directly observe the cup. That's, outside of like full-blown crazy skeptical scenarios, the best way that we have to come to know anything is through direct observation of it. Inductive reasoning is all of the kinds of reasoning that we have to things that we don't directly observe, right? So like the super easy case is like you look outside your window in the morning and it's wet everywhere. Well, you didn't directly observe that it was raining, but you are justified in believing that it rained last night. And that is an inductive bit of reasoning. You reasoned from the evidence that was the result of the rain, right, back to that it rained. That seems like a good way to think, right? A good way to reason. Okay, well, those seemingly are the only two options here. There might be another kind of way of having knowledge or justification that has to do with like internal perception or something like that. Like you don't directly observe your feelings, right? But you know your feelings because you have special access to them, right? Like you know when you're sad, you know when you're hungry. But that's not the same thing as the future like past principle. And like the future like past principle is like, it's not even like math exactly. It's just like this it's this principle that we use in our reasoning, but it's like how do I know that it's a good principle? Well, the argument here is basically saying, look, you don't know that it's a good principle on the basis of direct observation because you can't see the principle, right? You can't like just go see the principle. There isn't like a, like how would that even work? You can't go into the future to make sure that the past and the future match up, given how time works. Maybe time travel is possible, and maybe then we will be able to somehow. But that seems unlikely. Currently, we can't time travel, and so we can't directly observe that the future like past principle is justified. We don't have the ability to check in the way that we do in like science, like scientific direct observation. You run an experiment. You see what happens in the experiment. Then you are justified in your results, right? Because you saw it, you directly observed it. Okay, so you can't be directly observing the FLP. So maybe you can justify it by inductive reasoning. Well, problem here, argument says you can't. You can't justify the future like past principle by inductive reasoning. Why? Because that would be circular reasoning. Why would it be circular reasoning? Well, because all of our inductive reasoning depends on the future like past principle to begin with. Why does it do that? Well, because all inductive reasoning requires our expectation that like things that happened before will be similar to things that happen after, right? So like think about your reasoning about it having rained last night, given that it's wet outside. Well, what ultimately are you depending on when you're making that inductive leap? You're depending on the fact that in the past, every time it rains, it makes everything wet outside, right? And so you're drawing that connection. That's happened every single time that it's ever rained in the past. And so you're then drawing it to now. You're saying like, okay, cool. That's going to happen again. It's still happening. But the problem then is that you're using the future like past principle. And so you can't inductively, justify the future like past principle because it's being used in the inductive reasoning itself. So if you're using, if what it is to inductively reason is to use the future like past principle, then you can't justify the future like past principle by using inductive reasoning, right? It's yeah, it's hard to make another kind of like analogy here, but it's like imagining having like a tool to make another tool or something like that, but you can't you can't use the tool to make itself, right? That would be impossible. Maybe you could use it to make like copies of itself or something like that, but you can't use a tool to make itself. And that's the point here, is that the tool is baked into the inductive reasoning. So to try and justify the future like past principle using inductive reasoning, not going to work. So if that's correct, like, we've now premise 2 and premise 3, we've denied, that you can justify the future like past principle by direct observation. We've denied that you can justify it by inductive reasoning. So it's unjustified. And if it's unjustified, then you don't know anything about the future that is based on it. And as we sort of said earlier, everything that you know about the future is based on the future like past principle, right? Your knowledge that the sun will rise tomorrow based on the future like past principle. And it turns out, according to this, you don't know that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. All right, this is another really difficult argument to determine where and how you might deny any of the premises. I am out. I have no idea. Here are some possibilities. You could maybe deny premise 1 by saying that there's a false dilemma here that's being run on premise 1, and that there's some other way to justify the future like past principle, something more akin to what I was saying earlier, like that there's a like you have direct special access to your own mental states, your own physical feelings. Seemingly, we also have this like special ability to know certain mathematical truths or things that are like certain in certain ways, without like necessarily seeing them out in the world. I mean, like I can count things like, 2 things plus 2 things equals 4 things, but the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4 always and forever and for all time, right? That seems like something that I can know in a different way. It's not like I directly observe that fact or achieve that fact through inductive reasoning. So maybe the future like past principle can be justified in some other way, and so premise one would be false because there's a third option. If you were to choose that, you'd want to try and explain that third option and be plausible about it. If instead you want to deny premise two, you would need to come up with a reason for thinking that it's possible to directly observe the future like past principle in some way, right? Or like that it's true. I've thought about this in a way, like imagining that it seems like you could say that you directly observe the future like past principle in action in the past, right? It seems like in the past you have seen that the future is similar to the past. And so like right now you're thinking about the past is observing that the future in the past was like the past in the past, right? Which is a wild thing to try and say clearly, but maybe that is a way of observing something. You would want to try and figure out a way of justifying that there, though, without appealing to inductive reasoning. And I don't know if you can do that because that sounds like you're basically just using inductive reasoning based on past observation. But I don't know. There's maybe something there. And then the other possibility is to deny that that the circular reasoning involved in inductively justifying the future like past principle is actually problematic. You could say something along the lines of like, well, look, some kinds of circular reasoning are acceptable. This is a very complicated situation, but there are cases of this in like logic, where it turns out that in order to justify certain kinds of logical principles, it seems like we need to use those logical principles to justify them, because we just don't have any other way of justifying things from the bottom up. And so if that's the case, then maybe there are some situations, and maybe the future like past principle is one of them, where certain things can be self-justifying, if that makes sense, right? A self-justifying principle. Maybe it is in the offing here. And so maybe it's possible to say that. These are all complicated things that I don't have a whole lot more to say about, but really here in this, if you wrote this paper, almost everything that you're going to be doing in explaining this paper is explaining the argument, because there's so much going on in this argument that is all interesting, but it's a lot. All right. Does anyone have any other questions, comments, concerns? Here is the Google form one last time. If you haven't signed in yet. And if nobody has any other questions, then feel free to take off. We'll stop the recording.